Welcome to the Conscious Living Podcast, conversations to educate, empower, and enlighten our world. An uplifting and inspiring series of conversations and talks with your host, Jackie Woodside. We are educating minds, empowering lives, and enlightening souls to create a world where love prevails. In this engaging podcast, we deliver exciting, positive, transformative talks and teachings designed to elevate your life. Now, let's join our host, Jackie Woodside, for this week's session.
Hello, everyone. Hi there. I'm so glad you're with us again today for another episode of the Conscious Living Podcast, where we are here to educate, empower, and enlighten our world with strategies to live more consciously with time, money, and life itself. How conscious are you living today? How are you feeling? How are you doing in these times that we're living in? You know, it's a difficult time to stay conscious, to stay in your body, to stay living a faith-filled existence. And that's why I love doing this podcast, because I really do care about people understanding that the locus of your control, no matter what's going on outside of you, is inside your own consciousness. So today I have the great pleasure and joy of interviewing a dear, dear friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Dawson Church, he's one of my favorite authors. In fact, I had a little fangirl moment when I got to meet Dawson, because I had just finished reading his book called Mind to Matter, which became really one of my go-to books about the intersection of science and spirituality. He's written a number of books, and we're going today to dive into his most recent book, which is called Spiritual Intelligence: Activating the Four Circuits of the Awakened Brain. Gosh, he's done so much more and has so many more accolades, but I really want to give our time to the lessons of spiritual intelligence. So Dawson, thank you so much for being here with us. I always love our collaborations.
I love them too, Jackie. It's wonderful to have them, wonderful to share, and it's a delight to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I was one of the early readers of Spiritual Intelligence. I appreciated you giving me several chapters of it before it was released. I went through it very, very quickly, digested it while I was on my trip to California the last time we saw each other. I read it on the plane on the way home. So that was lovely. Tell our listeners a little bit about what this notion of spiritual intelligence is, what it means, and then, of course, how do we activate it in our brain?
Well, we all know what IQ is, and science began to measure intellectual quotient in the early 1900s. And so we have a century and a quarter of data on IQ levels and how to measure them, how to be aware of them. And it was a really important concept to start measuring one of our intelligences. And then in the 1980s, the concept of emotional intelligence came along. We realized that IQ wasn't everything. We've all met people who are really smart and can do the dumbest things, and they may not have emotional intelligence. And so I've run into many of those in the past. And so we learned that EQ is really powerful. And then the whole theory of multiple intelligences was developed, where we know that there's musical intelligence and kinesthetic intelligence and many other kinds of intelligences. And spiritual intelligence has intrigued me for many, many years. And I met people who are inherently spiritually intelligent. And to give you an example, think just now, this very moment, to somebody in your life you've either heard about, maybe you've known personally, who's really inspired you. When I do this in a big public group or in a workshop, then people say, oh, it was, Martin Luther King, it was Mother Teresa, it was Mohandas Gandhi, it was Rumi, it was Saint Teresa and Catherine. And the people know intuitively that there is a thing called spiritual intelligence. What I go about doing in the book, Spiritual Intelligence, is looking at the science behind it. And it turned out, when I began to take a deep dive into this, that spiritual intelligence is actually hardwired into every human brain. These discoveries were made in the early part of the 20th century, and neuroscientists who were putting monks and nuns into MRIs found that these highly spiritually intelligent people had 4 brain networks that were really active, unusually active in these adepts with high spiritual intelligence. And they map these circuits. They find they're really active. Just one of them, for example, I won't go into all four of them. One of them is compassion. And compassion is handled by a lobe, a big lobe of the brain called the insula. And the insula is lit up in these monks and nuns. So that was the big discovery, that there were four distinct circuits. But the exciting application of this was that it's not four circuits that monks and nuns only have. It's four circuits that every human being has. And so we can all learn to turn on our spiritual intelligence. We can activate our compassion network. And when we do this very, very quickly. We suddenly start to have enormous surges of love, of well-being, and of shifts in our physiological functions. So that's what it is. Those people who have it. And you have this brain hardware too.
It's so inspiring. I love living in the era that we are, that neuroscience has just taken off and the technology is so profound. We're learning so much about that intersection of science and spirituality. Just this morning, I read an article about an addiction that people aren't aware of. And it is that when people feel or seek revenge, the same parts of their brain lights up as if they're taking a drug or just about go to the place where they get their drug, or the anticipation of the drug. And I just thought it's, that's really important science, because if you know what's turning it on, you can also learn, and they actually, the science showed this, that teaching people to practice forgiveness turns off that craving and desire for that kind of revenge. So tell us more about how you activate it.
I want to just mention one more thing about science, and that is that we have these spiritual traditions, the Christian mystical tradition, the Jewish metaphysical tradition and Kabbalah. We have Buddhism, we have Hinduism, we have Taoism, all the Eastern religions. And they have brought forward, over the course of tens of thousands of years of experimentation and practice, codified in scripture, starting around 3,000 years ago, codifying in scriptures these practices that develop spiritual intelligence. And so we have this enormous wealth, spiritual wealth of the world now, in a way in which we didn't have even 50, 100 years ago. You had to travel to the Himalayas, you had to travel to the Andes, you had to go into the deep jungle, you had to go find hermits who lived in caves, or mystics who lived in monasteries. And so now we have access to all this stuff, but there's a huge amount of it. There are tens of thousands of books. There are all these spiritual paths. How do we know what works, and how do we know what we should do? So it's a bewildering mishmash to the average reader, like it was to me when I first got into that stuff 50 years ago. And what science does is science tells us which of these practices are effective. We put people in an MRI, we slide them into the MRI tube, we say, okay, feel compassion, and then we see what parts of the brain light up. Then we look at the practices they're using, and we're seeing what really works. We hook people up to EEGs, and we see what parts of their brains light up. But what we then do, and this is the critical part in chapter 5 of spiritual intelligence, is called enlightenment without spirituality. We now do this with atheists and agnostics and people who have no spiritual background whatsoever. We can give them certain highly specific practices drawn from those scientific studies of the brain, and we don't even have to make them religious or put them through a class or have them read anything. We simply have them do certain things that trigger shifts in their brains, and boom, they're having full-fledged mystical experiences. And in chapter 2 of the book, I apply this to Chapter 2 is all about shrinking your brain and growing your brain. We know that parts of the brain grow in these mystics. They have a big insula, this part of the brain that handles compassion. They have a very small amygdala. The stress centers of the brain are small in these mystics. The love, the compassion, the happiness parts start to grow like crazy. So we know that's true of these mystics. One of the absolutely astonishing pieces of research I review in chapter 2 of spiritual intelligence is looking at brains that shrink. And every human brain shrinks after the age of about 30. By the age of about 85, we've lost an average of 25% of our brain mass on average, just in the natural course of shrinkage. So our brains are shrinking a lot as we age. Alzheimer's brains, though, don't shrink 25%. Alzheimer's patients can have their brain shrink 75%. And in one of the images of spiritual intelligence, I have two brains on a morgue slab. I don't show you the rest of the cadaver, but I do show you the two brains side by side, Alzheimer's and normal 65-year-old. The Alzheimer's brain looks like a little shriveled walnut. I mean, it's shrunk so much. So we have this natural brain shrinkage going on. And in the research I cite in chapter 2, researchers have been now having Alzheimer's patients with full-blown Alzheimer's, cognitive decline, do these neuroscience-backed meditative techniques. And within 6 months, the Alzheimer's brain begins to regrow. So it's having astonishing effects on our body and our nervous system to be practicing, to be activating our spiritual intelligence.
That is mind-blowing. So can you tell us what some of those practices are?
It's essential that they be physiologically based. And what neuroscience lets us do is sift all the stuff from that really works from the stuff that doesn't really work. And it's kind of interesting to see what really works, and what really works actually is a very small subset of meditative practices. What most people do when they think of meditation is actually inert and unhelpful and may even be an impediment to reaching those states. The way I was taught to meditate at 15, where the meditation master said, sit there and be still your mind, and just pay attention to your breath, let your thoughts come and go. That was completely useless advice to me. It did not result in me learning to meditate or finding inner peace. And that's why so many people try those old-fashioned instructions and they don't work. So what does work is several practices. They're all body-based. They're all based in a physiological shift. And so I boiled those into a technique called eco-meditation. And we began to study that in time. Eventually, we began to do EEG and MRI studies. And we found that in 30 days of doing eco-meditation, that people can reach the same kinds of states that take these adepts doing regular meditation 10,000 hours. They can get there in 30 days if they're using, again, the physiologically based techniques. Those Alzheimer's patients did it for 6 months, 30 minutes a day. But again, they were breathing in a certain rhythm, physiological. They were relaxing certain muscles, physiological. They were doing a body scan, physiological. They were doing all these things to affect their bodies. So you have to have a technique that's not mental, not thinking about stuff, not imagining things. You need a technique that's highly physiological.
That is just fascinating, hearing that connection between the mind and body with echo meditation. So, but there are things in echo meditation you do with your mind as well. There's certain focus, and doing a body scan directs the mind in a particular way. So it really is a mind-body approach using echo meditation. Is that accurate?
You have to give the mind something to do. If it has nothing to do, it tends to get bored and spiral off and start thinking about stuff. And thinking is not your friend. When it comes to meditation, in fact, when it comes to life in general, we'd be much happier if we thought about 2% of the amount we actually do think. We think all kinds of thoughts, repetitive thoughts. It's called rumination in psychology, and they're not happy thoughts. In one famous, enormous study, they say that a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. And so in eco-meditation, we give the mind a few little tasks to keep it busy and to give it the illusion to delude itself into thinking it's important. So we give it a little bit of activity to chew on, and those few little cues are enough to keep it happy. It's like, oh, I'm the mind. I'm making a big contribution to the meditation over here. So so we throw that in to keep the mind busy. It's like throwing the dog a bone, keep it from barking. But that's about the extent of it.
I love the way you describe that, Dawson. I talk in my body of work about using your mind to train your brain. But I love that little description you just gave, that the mind has to have something to do to keep it busy so that it feels important. So you're dipping a little bit into the ego, that the ego needs to feel like it's needed and it's important and it has a role. And so I love the way that you describe that. I think that's very, very prime. Talk about the benefits of, say, a person who's spiritually intelligent versus, say, the study I read this morning, people who are steeped in revenge or that kind of negativity and blame. And, what kinds of benefits do people have from becoming spiritually intelligent?
One set of benefits is increased health. And this shows up in cortical scans. So we can scan your brain and measure how thick your cortex is. The cortex is the outer layer of tissue on the brain, and that's the part that shrinks the most. And essentially, people who are healthier, their cortex shrinks less. In the unhealthiest people, it shrinks the most. And so in those Alzheimer's patients that were shrinking 70% or more, the cortex is shrinking dramatically as we age. So you have a thicker cortex. That means you have less cognitive decline. And that's one reason we measure the brains of monks and mystics, and they have really enormously thick amounts of cortical matter, and their brain age is much younger than their chronological age. So you have much lower chances of Alzheimer's, dementia, cognitive decline than otherwise. Genes. My very first best-selling book is called The Genie in Your Genes, and it showed that there are massive genetic changes happening in people who are developing their spiritual intelligence. In one early study, they showed that 94 genes were affected. Other subsequent studies show that many more genes are affected. Your genes are playing a role in inflammation, in muscle mass growth. So muscle mass, bone density, skin elasticity, three big markers of aging, that people have more muscle mass as they develop spiritual intelligence. They have more bone density as they develop spiritual intelligence. And their skin, you see some of these like Tai Chi masters, and they're over 100 years old, and their skin looks like a 30 or 40-year-old. And I mean, that's just an indication of lower aging. Go look at photographs of refugees. Go look at some of the images of people in Gaza, and they're 40 years old, but after having lived through a few months of savage, barbaric attempts to eliminate their lives, their skins, they look much, much older than they actually are. So stress produces all of these shifts in internal biology, and monks and mystics tend to have long lives, and they tend to have really young organs. And when you start improving your brain age, your whole body goes along with it. One woman who we have a course called The Short Path to Oneness, where we train people in spiritual intelligence, give them a therapist, give them a mentor, put them in a really advanced course for a year. But she began doing this course, again, focusing on meditation, on developing a spiritual intelligence. She had a massive tumor in her abdomen. It went away. She had such severe congestive heart failure that only 30% of the blood that should have been flowing through her heart was. After 3 months, 100% was. So people have these big healings, big physical shifts. Their gene expression is changing. The other big change we see is telomere length. And telomeres are your main aging markers. They shrink as you age. In normal aging, telomeres get shorter and shorter and shorter by about 1% a year. In meditators and people developing spiritual intelligence, they quit shrinking, they start to grow. So all of those are just some of the physical benefits. In terms of emotions, you start to reach levels of happiness. In one set of studies I explain in the book, researchers put these monks into EEG, and they had measured their levels of various brainwaves. Their levels of the happiness, contentment, gratitude brainwaves went up 20-fold. So massive increases in joy. That's why these people are so happy, just because they've developed their spiritual intelligence. So the list of benefits is pretty much, it is so vast it's actually hard to even comprehend that one simple thing, like devoting 20, 30 minutes a day to spiritual intelligence, can produce this vast range of massive grades to your neurology and your biology. But it's true, the evidence is there in hundreds of studies that it does.
Wow, I love that. I love how much of an impact it is. And Dawson, every time I have a conversation like this, I think, why doesn't everyone want to live this way? Right? Like, so what makes it like, so why are we, how do you make sense of it? That our world is a difficult place and there's lots of kind of current evidence that we're more devolving than evolving as a human species right now. How do you make sense of it when what you've just said is it improves your, being a spiritually minded person and growing your spiritual intelligence, being a person practicing echo meditation, attending to your inner world, growing in consciousness, makes your life so much better. You're healthier, you're happier, you have better relationships. Why is it so hard?
People don't know. They don't know the science behind it. Even neuroscientists don't realize the extent of gene expression change, for example, that results from meditation. And so people don't know. That's why there are authors who write popular science books like me. And my books aren't textbooks. They aren't, they do have a lot of references that support them, but I have stories of people with spiritual intelligence. Like I begin in chapter 1 with the story of a man who was wrongfully imprisoned for 30 years. His name is Anthony Ray Hinton. And he was wrongfully imprisoned. He was black, and a racist prosecutor in Alabama put him behind bars for 2 murders that he did not commit. And there was ample evidence he was innocent, but he was kept there. And then when the evidence just stacked up after 10 years, the state attorney general refused to rehear his case. Eventually, his prison guards were writing to the governor and the president demanding that he get a fair trial, and the governor denied clemency. The case eventually reached the Supreme Court. He was set free after 30 years, but it took 30 years of his life, and yet when he was asked if he resented those people, his answer was, if I spent time resenting those people who took 30 years away from me, I would be taking time away from me, and I'm not going to do that for even 1 second. And he had such spiritual intelligence, he mentored younger prisoners in the prison. The guards came to him for advice and support. He was this glowing example of it. So Nelson Mandela, same thing. I mean, you find these people who have terrible circumstances and yet radiate joy and love. So the book is full of stories of people in the Holocaust, in Germany, in some of the modern, hugely problematic parts of the world, like Thich Nhat Hanh, who have been able to become beacons of light. And so people just don't know that it's possible to do this, even despite the worst of circumstances. And it's really hard to explain how happy you get and how good you feel. One example I use is there is a basketball player on the local team here where I live called Steph Curry. And Steph Curry is one of the best basketball players in the world. He can jump over 1 yard high, over 1 meter high. He can jump standing still, that's 3 feet. He can just jump up that 3 feet. So we hear stories of feats of athleticism like that. And so what we find in these spiritual intelligence studies is that these monks and mystics who were studying, they are having 20 times the amount of happy brain activity as the average person. If I told you Steph Curry could jump 20 yards up in the air, I lose you. And that's where we lose people. I sit around and talk to other neuroscience experts sometimes about this, and we say, how do we explain this to people that you can jump 20 yards in the air? Metaphorically speaking, you can get that happy. You can get so happy, it literally blows your mental circuits, your blows your mind. It's like a drug trip. We have to liken it. In fact, it's like ayahuasca or ecstasy or THC. I mean, you're getting so much of these pleasure neurochemicals in your brain, but it's really hard to explain. So we use analogies to explain it, like the Steph Curry analogy. We show people the brainwave graphs, and the big picture here is we all have the four circuits of the awakened brain hardwired into our heads. The tragedy, Jackie, is for most people, they're turned off because stress turns them off. Stress just shuts down those four circuits. When you de-stress, you can turn on those four circuits. And so people just don't know how much better their lives can get. And that's where science comes in. Science shows us not, we look at a monk or a mystic, we look at a Rumi or read the poetry of Mary Oliver and say, oh, how wonderful, they were in ecstasy. But when I tell you that Rumi circuit is in your brain, that Mary Oliver circuit is right over here, we can name it, we can measure it, we can graph it, we can quantify it. That's, I think, a message that people can understand.
I love that. So we all have that capacity to develop an awakened brain, is what you're saying.
We're born with it. We're naturally born with it. Buddha calls it our natural state. He calls that natural mind. In Hinduism, they call samadhi, the elevated state, nirvana. They call that the natural state of the mind. They regard anything other than living in bliss with the awakened brain as abnormal.
Right. Isn't that a different way of seeing it? Right. We're the ones, humanity, the human experience. They're the ones that have the abnormal brain, not the awakened brain state. It is an awakened brain that is the true definition of living life consciously. So,
it changes the unit. So consciousness and the brain go together. Consciousness is the energy of the universe. And what you do, the definition of spiritual intelligence, which I give in chapter 1 of the book, is the ability of your individual consciousness. Like, Jackie, you're conscious. I know you're conscious. We're having a conscious conversation over here. Everyone listening is conscious. That's our individual consciousness. But we know from reading the mental states of Buddha and Jesus and Mary and St. Catherine and all these mystics, we know that there is also something which the Hindus call superconsciousness. And there is the infinite intelligence, the wisdom of the universe. And there's ample evidence in that first book of mine, Mind to Matter, that consciousness actually is the underlying substrate, the fundamental nature of the universe. And so we as individual consciousness can actually commune with, become one with, interact with that infinite consciousness. And when we do that in meditation, when you let go of your little individual separate consciousness and merge with all it is, that's when that bliss occurs. And so spiritual intelligence is the ability to make that connection, sustain it, and feel it flowing both ways, because it does flow. Once you surrender your individual consciousness, when you merge in oneness with divine consciousness, with infinite intelligence, with infinite oneness, then that starts to flow through you. You write poetry like Mary Oliver, or you sing in these inspired tones, or you move, you flow in your body. You have breakthrough ideas like great scientists. Einstein said every great scientific idea is born in this crucible of creativity, intuition, and creativity. So all the wisdom of the universe flows through you, utterly transforming not just your body, but the whole of your life around you. So people just don't know it's available. It's available to everyone. And then when we start to hook up and experience that, that becomes our new normal, and our lives and the world around us change radically. And as for all the chaos in the world, absolutely. Climate change is upon us in all its effects. Social inequality, income inequality, gender inequality, all of the problems of our world are very real. And people in so many ways are more compassionate today than they ever have been before. At the end of the book, I start to list them. I was working on this list. I was thinking, well, things like slavery. It took us 200 years to abolish slavery, give or take, in the Western world. And women's suffrage, that took about 100 years. These things, but they remained unchanged for millennia. Suddenly they changed in 100 years. But now things are changing in 10 years. Legalization of marijuana, gay marriage, animal rights. Animal rights are prevalent today in which they never were before. There are all these evidences of compassion now that weren't there 50, 60, 70 years ago. Modern veterinary care. I actually list them in one of the chapters in the book, and they are a very, very, very long list of all kinds of things that didn't even cross people's minds 50 years ago. Domestic violence, shelters for people who were victims of domestic violence, care, child abuse. When I was growing up, if you heard screaming from the house next door, your mom said, mind your own business. Now you call Child Protective Services. I mean, the world has changed radically. In one of the graphs I have in the last chapter, I show the murder rate worldwide for the last 1,000 years, because for 1,000 years, scribes in countries have been recording how many people got their throats slit by their neighbors every year. And guess what? It was 100-fold what it is today 100 years ago. And you see it dropping in 1300 and 1400 and 1500 AD and 1600 and 1700 and 1800 and 1900 and 2000. And today it's 1% of what it was 1,000 years ago. Deaths in war, same thing over the last millennium, have been dropping. I mean, slowly and with horrific interruptions like World War I and World War II. But there are so many measures by which people have been becoming more peaceful and more compassionate if you zoom out to that 1,000-year scale. So even though we have all of these terrible problems now, we are, as an aggregate over time, when you look at the time span of tens and hundreds of years, becoming more peaceful.
That's beautiful. Wow, that's a great note to end on, Dawson, that we do have these reasons to be hopeful, reasons to be optimistic, and evidence of consciousness changing to a more compassionate, more loving, and yes, more awakened world. And I want to thank you and acknowledge you for your contribution to that, Dawson. Your work is so powerful, and it's just so great to be able to bring you on the show and help people understand. So a couple things I want to say. Your book, Spiritual Intelligence, can be picked up on Barnes & Noble, or go to your local bookseller and ask them to order it for you. Or yes, you can also use Amazon, although I'm not doing that any longer. I'm using my local bookseller these days.
Go support your local bookseller whenever you possibly can.
Your local booksellers, exactly. And also, you have a free download of Echo Meditation, so that you're not just telling people about it here, but they can also go find it and become an Echo Meditation practitioner. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, there is. You can get it online. Also, at the end of each chapter of Spiritual Intelligence, there's a section called Extended Play Resources and Deepening Practices. And so what you do is you can go there, and there are free meditations, there are free transcripts, there are free videos, audios, all kinds of resources to develop your spiritual intelligence. The goal is, as you read the 7 chapters of Spiritual Intelligence, you're actually going on a journey of developing yours bit by bit. So go to the end of each chapter, download those resources, and that's also where you get a whole range of different tools, techniques, practices that will help you develop your own spiritual intelligence.
I love how practical your work is, too. It's one of the other things I love about it. So, Dawson, thank you so much for being here with us. We both got to get on to other meetings, but I could talk with you all day. Thank you so much for being here today.
Every blessing. It's been a joy. Thank you.
You bet.